Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. I fear that the war will now lead to revolution. Those words were uttered by Erich von Falkenhayn on the 29th of August, 1916, the day he was replaced as Chief of the General Staff by Paul von Hindenburg and his associate Erich Ludendorff. Those words proved to be prescient. The war did in fact lead to revolution, in fact to several. Indeed, the First World War led to the cataclysmic collapse of entire societies, and of the European order that had underpinned almost a century of relative stability and peace among the great powers. And yet the war lasted for another 2 years, resulting in millions more dead, both soldiers and civilians. But why did the war last so long? And why did Germany ultimately lose it? Those are just some of the questions Professor Holger Afflerbach returns to the center of historiographical attention in his sweeping and masterfully written account of the Great War, titled On a Knife Edge: How Germany Lost the First World War. Holger Afflerbach is Professor of Modern European History at the University of Leeds and is the author of a number of groundbreaking monographs on, among other topics, Erich von Falkenhayn, Kaiser Wilhelm II, as well as on the Triple Alliance. So it's my distinct pleasure to have Professor Afflerbach on this podcast for the first time. Holger, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you very much, David, for having me.
So I'd like to begin by asking you about kind of the motivation behind this book. In the introduction, you kind of outline a number of aspects that you want to bring out that you feel the historiography has either ignored or kind of downplayed. And there are two in particular that I'd like to touch on here right at the beginning. The first is the very fact that Germany ultimately lost the war is something that you think actually requires more explanation and a more careful explanation than to some extent has been given by the literature. After all, most observers, even right down to the autumn of 1918, actually expected the war to go on and on, and were surprised by the collapse of the Central Powers, maybe not so much Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, and to some extent Austria-Hungary, but we're certainly surprised by the suddenness also of the German collapse in particular. As you point out in the intro, the war was right down to the wire, on a knife edge, and this had important implications for how and why it ended. The other topic I think I'd like to tease you out on here at the start is the characterization of Imperial Germany's strategy, such as there was one, was for a long time portrayed was one where essentially the driving force of German strategy was straightforwardly expansionist, annexationist, aggressive, out for world domination. To use kind of the Fritz Fischer terminology, that comes from that whole debate. And you think that this is largely misleading and essentially an oversimplification of what was going on. So, if I could get you to kind of give us a sense of what you were trying to do in this book, how you would contextualize it against the backdrop of the wider literature on the war.
Well, you mentioned already some key arguments. The first one is the book is about German politics and strategy from 1914 to 1918. And I understand strategy in the sense, what did Imperial Germany want to achieve by fighting? Mm-hmm. So that is a fundamental question. And of course, the war started in August 1914 and it ended in November 1918. And it is unrealistic to think that there are not immense swings in these 4.5 years of fighting. Mm-hmm. And of course there are, but definitely this idea that Imperial Germany had embarked on a war of conquest or maybe even before the war broke out, because Fritz Fischer's second book, War of Illusion, claims that Imperial Germany had an ambition to become a world power by planning the First World War already from 1912 onwards. That is really not hitting the nail on its head. I personally believe that Germany stumbled into the war by a mismatched diplomatic maneuver. And, probably no sense in rehashing now the July crisis.
Right.
It's quite complicated.
Yeah.
But that it was not automatically planned to start a war, especially not that war, but it got out of hand. This does not reduce German responsibility, because better policy during the July crisis could have avoided that.
Right.
But then there they were, the war had started, and then to guarantee the participation of the entire population, it was sold to the German people as a war of defense. And here's already the very first major point which I want to make. Imperial Germany was not this kind of autocratic society it got credit for, so we always look towards the Kaiser and the court and Hindenburg and Ludendorff. For them, it's true what people think about them. But Imperial Germany, according to the last elections before the war in 1912, German social democracy had 34% of all votes. Will say Imperial Germany was more social democratic than Germany is now. And if you fight a world war, you have to try to integrate the vast majority of the population, and you cannot fight with 1/3 of the population being absolutely hostile, especially if we take then also the other parties into consideration, for example, left-wing liberal, center party, and so on. Then we have already far more than 50% of all voters in the left-wing or moderate center. And this is what I want to make clear. We have in Imperial Germany a fractured society, and to look always only on what Hindenburg and Ludendorff wanted is missing the big picture. You have a quite strong group, and the argument which Fritz Fischer and many others are making, the others don't count. So basically, this works only if you look only towards radicals and the general stuff and in the court, and you forget the entire rest. But over the entire war, you have to keep them on board. It started with the beginning of the war, with this Burgfrieden.
Right.
And this means they had to sell the war as a war of defense, claiming the Russians of having started the war because Russia was the first power who mobilized. Indeed, the Russian general mobilization was one of the at least massive accelerators during the July crisis, which cut short any possibility to find a diplomatic solution of the problem. So they could sell also to the social democracy the Russians as an aggressive power. And the Germans bought it that they were waging a war of defense. And this kind of consensus had to be kept intact over the entire duration of the war. And that is one of the big lost opportunities of the First World War, that we had in Germany a kind of peace party, which was probably most ready for negotiations in the second part of the war.
Right, yeah.
And this potential was never properly used, because the minimum condition on the German side of the Reichstag party, including the Social Democrats, was we don't want conquest, but we don't want losses either. So we want to walk out of the war on the basis of a status quo. That was a German minimal condition, and that was never met or offered. And this explains a part of the dynamic of the First World War, and one where I put considerable weight of my study.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I want to definitely return to the question of, you know, the extent to which the Central Powers were, in fact, at certain points during the war, at least 3 times you mentioned in the book, did put out kind of peace feelers, I guess you could call them. You know, it's hard to kind of know how to designate them exactly, but because
May I immediately interrupt?
Please.
To clarify that. Yeah. Because Germany and Austria-Hungary made more than 3 peace feelers. We, you know, the first one was secret diplomacy, so that they started to send a middleman to enemy powers to find if they are ready for a separate peace. That started already in autumn 1914, that they used a Danish middleman, Andersen, to try to broker a peace with a separate peace with Russia. And then the number of this kind of secret peace feelers, meetings in Switzerland and so on, there were dozens of attempts to move on in this way, up to the very end of the war, when they were really hoping to use the Queen of the Netherlands, the Dutch Queen, as a middleman. Nothing came out of that. So, and after 2 years trying to do that, and in brackets, they offered that to the Tsar, and the Tsar himself said about the possibility of a separate peace. My reply can only be a negative one, because he said we have an agreement with our partners to don't conclude a separate peace. So this man could have saved himself, his family, his dynasty, and his country by leaving the war when it was still time, unharmed, pretty much unharmed. The conditions would have been favorable. Well, this did not happen. Then, in a second go, the Central Powers said, we are not moving forward in this way. We have to do something more visible. And then they made a public peace offer to all enemy powers. And that was a peace declaration, the peace offer of the Central Powers in December 1916. And that was immediately rejected by the Allied powers. It also came in a moment of a military triumph of the Central Powers. Romania had entered the war in August 1916, and instead of being the death knell for the Central Powers, the Central Powers conquered Bucharest in December, and took that as a moment, a good moment to make this peace offer, because they were always afraid that the peace offer would be taken as a sign of weakness by the enemy. So they thought, this is a good moment, that we are militarily there's a favorable situation, considerable success. Now we can make peace offer.
Right.
From the Allied point of view, it sounded triumphalist. And they said, well, there are no concrete conditions, and it is only let us talk, and this leads nowhere, and we don't believe in the enemy's good intentions. So they brushed it away. In the same moment, also Woodrow Wilson tried to broker a peace, but also that fell flat. Then the unlimited submarine warfare started, and the United States of America entered the war in April 1917 in due course. The second peace offer, so public peace offer, was a declaration of the German Reichstag, where they repeated, we don't want conquests. So we are against conquests of territory, and we are against a peace of enforced annexations and so on.
Right. This was in July 1917, right?
Yes, and also that was considered by the enemy powers to be worthless, because they said, well, Germany is a kind of military dictatorship, and what the Reichstag says is unimportant because Hindenburg and Ludendorff are the men in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one was when Soviet Russia, so after the October Revolution, 1917, the communists came to power in Russia. They immediately made an armistice, and peace negotiations started in Brest-Litovsk. And the Central Powers indeed had invited the Entente powers to participate. So basically make the peace conference with the communists a peace conference for all war-waging countries of the First World War. That peace offer was massively contested, because they said, if the Allies really come, so we don't believe they come, but if they come, all of our strategic gains against Russia will be probably, we have to give them up if they come.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question would have appeared, are the Central Powers ready to trade the victory in the East for a general peace?
Right.
And this question was never relevant. And we have also to say, because here historical truth is necessary and honesty, that probably the Central Powers were also a little bit relieved. Here we have to say that also the people who said we don't want annexations and we don't want and we want peace, that they of course could be seduced by military successes.
Right.
And after winning against Russia, creating a new map of Eastern Europe, remove the Russian threat once and for all. And also saying, why the hell should we keep the Russian multinational empire together against the will of its populations? That is not our task. So there were a lot of reasons why even the left-wing part of the Reichstag kind of supported it. So the Social Democrats did not vote for the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, but they abstained because they said, at last, it's peace. Mm-hmm. We don't agree with the conditions, but we agree with the peace. So they abstained from the vote. And the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk is always considered to be an imperialist peace of the Central Powers. But if we look very carefully, we could even find counter arguments.
Right. Let me zoom in, Holger, on precisely this period from late 1916 into the spring of 1917, which is one of these crucial turning points that you describe very well in the book. You mentioned just now the peace overture in the Reichstag by Bethmann Hollweg, the chancellor, when, like you said, they had just defeated Romania, and just shortly thereafter, Wilson intervenes and asks both parties to state their war aims. It's important to remember for the listeners at this point, the United States was not yet in the war, right?
Yes.
It was still a neutral power. And Germany kind of prevaricates, doesn't exactly state its war aims. The Entente does, but their war aims are very explicit and very shocking to even the populations of the Central Powers, right? The peoples of the Central Powers, because they explicitly state that one of their war aims is the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. But so give us a sense of how this particular period kind of radicalizes the war again, right? Because only a few months later, Imperial Germany will decide to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which is ultimately, together with the Zimmermann telegram, the key thing that does bring the United States into the war, which is one of the most crucial factors in ultimately in the ultimate collapse of the Central Powers. So because very often that decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare has been interpreted as yet more evidence of, you know, basically kind of German, you know, autocratic barbarism, or however you want to think about it, you know. But placing it in that chronological context kind of gives it makes it appear more of a reaction and a kind of desperate attempt to force peace by military victory. So if you could kind of, I don't want to confuse matters too much, but if you could kind of, you know, for our listeners, give us a sense of those crucial months.
So indeed, I think, or I also believe that everything between late summer 1916 and February 1917 is practically the climax of the history of Germany fighting the First World War, where crucial decisions were made. And to start with a quote of Winston Churchill, who wrote in The World Crisis, so his recollections of the First World War, that between victory and defeat of Germany were 5 weeks. And he means the period between the 1st of February 1917, which was a declaration of the unlimited submarine warfare, which brought in due course the United States into the war, and mid-March 1917, the first Russian Revolution. What he means is that Germany acted out of despair, let's say, because there is a food crisis, a turnip winter in Germany in 1916-17. The military situation is good, but the home front issues are really pressing. And they say maybe we, at some point, we cannot continue because our internal situation deteriorates very quickly. So we have to come to an end. That was also the reason of the peace offer, because even Hindenburg and Ludendorff kind of agreed with the civilian government on trying the peace offer. They said nothing will come out of it, but they were okay with trying. But they said also, if the enemy does not react positively on our peace offer, then we will use every weapon in our arsenal, because then a military victory is the only way out of the war. Mm-hmm. And this means submarine warfare, unlimited submarine warfare. So the peace offer and the submarine warfare were kind of linked. And that was, of course, a massive radicalization, and also very, very, very short-sighted.
Yeah.
If and now we have to make to our listeners, we have to make it clear, if Germany had abstained of declaring the unlimited submarine warfare on the 1st of February 1917, the following things would have happened for sure. The United States would have continued to be neutral, point one. Mm-hmm. Point two, Russian Revolution would have still started in mid-March, and will say it was not immediately clear that Russia will drop out of the war, but the likelihood of that happening was enormous. So that was the second thing. And the third thing, the Allied powers, and especially Britain, who was a kind of financier of the Entente coalition, were running low of money to buy goods in the United States of America. And in spring 1917, a very, very substantial financial crisis would have happened. This maybe they would have found a way around that. But also Britain's financial means were not unlimited, and they were radically coming to an end. And in this particular moment, I would say that the German strategic situation would have looked quite bright. Because imagine Britain, France, and Italy have to win against the Central Powers alone. Russia drops out, the United States of America are neutral. How the hell would they have won the First World War? Right. I think they couldn't. And for that reason, the war would have ended in a stalemate. It was a stalemate from 1914 onwards. It would have continued as a stalemate. I don't think the Central Powers could have won against Britain, France, and Italy either. It would have continued, but at some point, or they would have found a compromise, or they were still fighting today. You know, there was no real hope for victory on the battlefield without the Americans. Right. And that is also, you know, you read, if you go into British literature on the First World War, there's a lot about the learning curve and the British Army getting better and so on, all true. But at the end of the day, if you look towards the operations in France in 1918, without the 2 million Americans being in northern France, all that would not have happened.
Right. And in fact, you point out in the book that one of the, there's a huge literature, obviously, on how exactly the war ended. I've had Alexander Watson also on the podcast who's written about this. But one of the points you make is that, you know, it was really when German soldiers started to get the sense that, you know, it's just a hopeless task because, you know, you lose 1 million men in 1918 in the German offensives. But on the other side, there's just a constant stream of fresh Americans. And you know, the Central Powers had completely underestimated the United States militarily, right? They didn't think the American military power, actual boots on the ground, would make the slightest difference, right? So by the time the July peace resolution in the Reichstag happens, as you said, in any case, it was, you know, the Entente powers discounted it because they had an understanding of the political structure of Imperial Germany, which basically led them to believe that the Reichstag was kind of a puppet kind of institution that had no real influence on decision making. But in any case, it came too late, right? Because at that point, the United States was in the war, and in fact, the peace resolution was rejected by Wilson, who only a few months earlier had given a speech in the Senate talking about a peace without victory.
Yes, it is true. And to make the panorama complete, even Ludendorff admitted that if there were a British peace offer, Germany would be unable to reject that because of its internal situation. So it very much depended on the enemy. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Europe was in the hands of people. Of course, Hindenburg and Ludendorff are part of it, which Philipp Scheidemann, a German social democratic leader in the Reichstag, called die Internationale der Kriegsverlängerer. German word very difficult to translate into proper English, but it means the international of warmongers and war prolongers, so that the hardliners in the various countries always needed each other to force the own population to fight on. So Lloyd George had to point towards Ludendorff and his uncompromising stance, and Ludendorff needed Lloyd George, and so on.
Yeah. There are a number of points. We just mentioned this turning point in 1916 and 1917, and what you mentioned about what Churchill wrote is really interesting. There are a couple of moments even before that. Actually already in mid-September 1914, Falkenhayn, whom you've written a biography about, comes to see that this war is different. This war cannot be won in the traditional way, so to speak. This is not a repeat of 1870, 1871. And Falkenhayn actually counsels Beth van Holweg, the chancellor, to look for a way to end this war by to look for a political solution. And absent that, the only available military strategy is basically a war of attrition. Talk a little bit about this important character. To some extent, he was then overshadowed, obviously, also in the literature by the OHL, by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. But he was very farsighted in a certain sense, right? He saw very early in the war that in a certain sense the game was up, and one had to find a way to get out of this gigantic mess.
That is correct. So just to mention the German military high command, it's the chief of the general staff who is practically the commander of the German armies. And the first one was Moltke the Younger, and he was replaced in September 1914 by Falkenhayn, and then Falkenhayn was replaced in late August 1916 by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And Ludendorff at the very end of the war was replaced by Gröner, but Hindenburg stayed. Okay, and Falkenhayn, when he replaced Moltke, first in a transitional period from September to November 1914 as a kind of placeholder, and then definitely he replaced Moltke, tried first to repair militarily the mess. The German plan of a quick victory against the French had run aground in September 1914 during the Marne battle. The German armies had to retreat, and then they tried to repair that by making new attacks in the west, which was always called the race to the sea, and that ended with the terrible Battle of Ypres. And in November 1914, Falkenhayn indeed understood that this will not work for several reasons, that the Germans did not have the power to win against all enemies, against the British, against the French, against the Belgians, against the Russians, that was not going to happen, that Germany did not have the military means to win militarily, and for that reason a political solution was needed. That was, of course, a tough call. He went to the Chancellor and he said the German army is broke. We cannot win that. We need a political solution. And he outlined also how he imagined the political solution. He said, let's try to broker a peace with Russia or with France, and then England will give up as well. Mm-hmm. If we continue, for example, warfare with submarines and so on. That was his suggestion. But it was the Chancellor who had to do that. And Bethmann Hollweg was not pleased to hear that, also for several reasons. The first one, he distrusted Falkenhayn, and he did not think that Falkenhayn is the best man available for this decisive position, and he thought that maybe others can do it better. And then he was also afraid to stop the war. Germany had already a high number of casualties, returning home empty-handed, and then looking in the eyes of the mothers who lost their sons on the battlefield and ask him, why did my son die? And he had no answer for that. And this was, of course, a problem after a few months of warfare, that they said we need a justification for our sacrifices.
Right.
We cannot return home empty-handedly. And for that reason, he was hesitant and wavering. He did not say completely, no, we don't do it, but he did not say yes either. So he was somewhere in between and terribly half-heartedly. And then this attempt to broker separate peace with Russia came practically by chance. You know, there was an independent initiative and he did not stop it. But Bethmann-Hollweg did not embark on a proper peace policy in this moment, one which, of course, would have been needed. So if the head of your army comes and says we cannot win militarily, we need a political solution, then you need a very energetic person jumping at it and trying to make that work instead of letting it drift and hope that some happy events maybe will solve the question.
Yeah.
And that, unfortunately, was what happened. But Falkenhayn, in his entire tenure, did not put a lot of pressure on Bethmann for making annexations or something like that, because he stated, if we don't lose the war, we have won it. So that Falkenhayn, obviously from late autumn 1914, was of the opinion that Germany cannot win. But if Germany does not lose, it means that even this formidable coalition is not able to beat Germany. And that would have been what the contemporaries always compared with Frederick the Great and the Seven Years' War, you know, where Prussia fought alone against Austria, France, and Russia contemporaneously, and was able to quit without being beaten by a far superior coalition. And Falkenhayn, who made tons of other mistakes, so I don't claim that Falkenhayn was a flawless military leader, far from it, but at least he had a proper evaluation of what was possible and what was not possible, militarily speaking.
Right.
And Bethmann-Hollweg did not act on the peace question with a necessary rigor. He did not do that in 1914, and practically also his dismissal in 1917 had something to do with the peace initiative of the Reichstag and the question of peace. Bethmann-Hollweg did not exercise political leadership in the question of trying to broker peace.
Yeah, and it was sorely needed. That's why I started in the introduction with this quotation from Falkenhayn that you have at the beginning of one of your chapters, because it shows also that he, like you said, he made a ton of mistakes, including Verdun was badly planned, badly managed. But to mention also another mistake, so that we cannot be blamed to whitewash Falkenhayn. Right.
He was against unlimited submarine warfare in 1915, but unfortunately he was in favor of unlimited submarine warfare in 1916. And I would say from all strategic mistakes Germany did, like, for example, the Schlieffen Plan and so on, the declaration of unlimited submarine warfare was the one mistake too many. So, and if I say the First World War was a draw and a stalemate, and in a European framework would have ended with a draw. This ended with Americans entering it. So Falkenhayn would have made this mistake as well.
Yeah. I want to touch now or I want to kind of sort of put in the spotlight a couple of themes that go to the question of, why it was so hard to stop the war and to reach a peace agreement. You've already mentioned one of them, which I think perhaps the most important, which is this kind of, I guess I would call it a kind of sunk cost dynamic, right? This idea that given the which already takes hold very early in the war, which is the sense that given the enormous sacrifices, on a scale that I think it's hard for us to even kind of wrap our heads around, because when you talk about millions.
If I may enter here, there is for this mechanism, David Stevenson used the word the war trap, that you have losses, you have to sell the reason for the losses at home to the public,
right?
And you try to evade, if humanly possible, to come empty-handed. Let's make an example in our own days. If, for example, the Russians are defeated in Ukraine and they have to leave all the conquered territories, how will Putin stand in front of the public audience in Russia? They will say, we lost hundreds of thousands of people on the battlefield. What is the gain? And if he cannot give an answer for this question, it will be very interesting if a political leader can stay in power.
Right. Yeah, it's a dynamic that's very common, right? I mean, you can also think of Vietnam, right?
Yes,
same thing, right? There had to be a decent interval between the Americans leaving in the fall of Saigon, precisely for that reason.
Yes, absolutely. And it was practically for show what the Americans did, so that there is a kind of little window, or at least they hope there will be, so that it does not look like a defeat.
Right, exactly.
But it did not happen either. I would say the mechanism is not only a World War I phenomenon.
Right. Yeah. It's a kind of more general psychological dynamic, right? That the right thing to do is to realize that this was always a gigantic mistake, and we need to stop at all costs, because to go on for even one more day is worse than any other alternative. But of course, the impetus, the psychological impetus, is to say, oh, maybe tomorrow we'll conquer whatever. Part of the rest of France or whatever, and it will all have been worth it. But that's the way to disaster, of course. The other dynamic that you draw out in the book is the kind of one of the impediments to kind of reaching a peace agreement or stopping the war was the alliance dynamics themselves, right? I guess on both sides, but of course your book is mostly focused on Germany and the Central Powers. So there was this there was a difficulty of coordinating, what terms would we accept, right? Bulgaria only enters the war to retake territory from Serbia, to some extent from Austro-Hungarian territory, and everybody wants everyone else to sacrifice something, right? So Germany wants Austro-Hungary to give up the Trentino to keep Italy happy. Austro-Hungary wants Germany to give back parts of Alsace-Lorraine, which were even German before the war even started. Right, so there's that. So talk a little bit about how that kind of dynamic puts sand in the gears of the attempts to kind of stop the war.
So you have a very good argument, saying that wars between wartime coalitions are notoriously difficult to broker peace, because all participating powers, there are two levels: the alliance level and the single state level of political decision making. And the single states have all their individual war aims, which are often not compatible with the war aims of their belligerent powers. So that France has other war aims than Britain, and Germany has other war aims than Austria-Hungary, and so on and so on. And if we make now a practical example, we mentioned already the peace offer of the Central Powers in December 1916. And before this peace offer was made, German and Austria, or German and Austro-Hungarian politicians were debating the content of the peace offer. And they said, it will probably be more efficient if we mention our conditions. And then they tried to put the conditions together. And then they said, well, if we mention our condition, the enemy will have a very good reason of saying no immediately. And they thought also that the peace conference will be a kind of horse trading event. And if they give away everything, for example, saying we don't want anything, that the enemy then will have the upper hand in the negotiations. One example is Germany wanted its colonies back, which were completely occupied by the Allied powers, with the exception of German East Africa. And they thought we need Belgium as a kind of guarantee or bargaining deal, so that we give up Belgium and we get our colonies back. And all this kind of questions made it very, very complicated to come up with proper and workable solutions. You know, from the perspective 100 years later, this looks, of course, completely different. We would say, what the hell did they care about the colonies? But they cared.
Yeah, and, to them it was important.
Yes, and they thought it's important.
Yeah. Holger, we're coming towards the end. I want to close on...
Maybe we have also to mention one argument which we touched on quite frequently without discussing it in full. And that was, why the hell did they decide for the unlimited submarine warfare, despite the fact that they were probably aware that the United States of America will enter the war?
Yeah.
And was that an act of political suicide, or what did they think? And if we look towards the arguments, they thought the Americans are already delivering full speed to the Allied powers. So the Americans are producing all kinds of materials to help the British and the French to sustain the war effort. Not only weapons, but all kinds of stuff. And so they are already doing that. If we have to try to hit hard Britain, and if the Americans declare war, most likely they will continue to deliver. So that basically is no big difference to the situation right now. And if at all, they will send a volunteers army. They will not send a multi-million drafted army. They will send a volunteer army over to fight on the European battlefield. And now we can say that was extremely short-sighted, but it was an evaluation of American politics from George Washington onwards to the earliest 20th century, and one key argument was that the Americans kept deliberately out of European affairs. And this idea that an American multi-million man army will come over looked in the eyes of the German decision makers quite improbable. And they said, anyway, the Americans are not properly armed because the American army is smaller than the army of Bulgaria, which is also true. The American army in 1917 was tiny.
Yeah.
And that was why they did what they did. And we can now say they were terribly short-sighted. But even Woodrow Wilson, as an American president, in the first go, thought that the United States of America will send a volunteer army. And only the events of 1917 will say the Russians dropped out. And then it really looked seriously as if the Germans may win the war, brought the Americans to make an enormous effort and to send millions of men over, which they could. This is what history showed. But we see in our own times, it's not easy to build up an army. And you have to mobilize your society and you have to gear up your economy and so on. But the Americans did that. And it is a fault of the German decision makers not to see that coming. And especially in the decisive meeting when they decided to declare unlimited submarine warfare, Bethmann Hollweg tried to stop that. So he was kind of against, but was in this particular meeting terribly ineffective. Terribly ineffective against a combination of the Kaiser, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, Holzendorff, the head of the Navy, and they got the upper hand, and Bethmann Hollweg was definitely not in good form.
Yeah, it was a kind of failure of imagination. I suppose you could call it that, in the sense that our interpretation of the American intervention.
They lost the war in 2 hours. So if they had decided differently, the likelihood that Germany would not have lost is pretty high.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, our interpretation of the American intervention, of course, is in a certain sense distorted by the fact that, well, first of all, we're 100 years after the events, but also there was a Second World War in between, in which the Americans also intervened, right, and also sent millions of men to Europe. But of course, at that point in 1917 and then 1918, the Americans had never done anything like that, right? And their army was like a small frontier army, really. I mean, it had fought, Mexican bandits and Native Americans and that kind of thing, but not an industrialized war.
Yes, okay, they had a big navy, but they had a small army.
Right.
In the Second World War, it was, we have to mention that Hitler declared war to the United States of America.
Right.
An absolutely absolutely crazy decision. Yeah. But okay, that is another topic.
That's another topic for another book for another day. Yeah. Holger, I want to end on this, which I think is as I read it anyway, the central argument, the most forceful argument in the book, and really a fresh take, I think, on the war and why it lasted so long and how it ultimately ended, which is that you argue, especially then kind of wrapping things up in the conclusion, that the Central Powers, and maybe actually Austria-Hungary just as much as Germany, but the Central Powers in general, realized sooner than the Entente, and maybe more forcefully, that this war was ultimately, whoever the victor was, it was ultimately going to be a Pyrrhic victory, because this war was leading Europe to its own self-destruction.
Yes,
and the Entente was not as responsible for the outbreak of the war, perhaps. I mean, that's a whole different discussion about the July crisis and everything. But in a certain sense, the Entente made the crucial mistake of kind of taking a slightly moralistic attitude to the whole situation and not taking seriously the idea that victory was ultimately going to be worthless, because this war was a cataclysm of just unprecedented proportions.
I could not agree more. We have to mention there were single voices in Britain who saw exactly this danger of a Pyrrhic victory, like, for example, Lord Lansdowne and his idea of a negotiated peace. But in total, it's indeed Britain, if we consider that probably Great Britain had a kind of decisive role in the decision making of the Entente powers, because without Britain it could not go on. And Britain was firmly embarked on victory, and Lord George was always asking the military leaders, will we be able to win? And they said, yes, we will. And then year after year, they tried hard with great losses to achieve that. At the end, they did it. So we can not even say they were wrong. But indeed, the collateral damage was enormous. And we are focusing always on Germany and poor Germany lost in Austria-Hungary. But I would say from all the enormous damage of the First World War, probably the worst one was what happened in Russia. So that Russia broke down, that that the communists took over, that the communists catapulted Russia out of normal European developments and international relations. The entire interwar period was overshadowed by that, and I would say the entire 20th century as well. And there was a point, not of no return, but a point of no repair. I would say there was a point of no repair in the First World War, where the collateral damage was so enormous that whatever they decided on a peace conference like Versailles, it was not fixable. And this moment was at the very latest in 1917, when the communists took over in Russia and started to shape the 20th century.
Right, yeah. So the Entente would have been better served trying to, not trying to keep Russia in the war at all costs, right?
Well, this is not only my idea. Colonel House, the advisor of Woodrow Wilson, said in summer 1917 something along the lines that it is more important to establish in Russia a viable democracy than bringing Germany on its knees. So this man made already the point, but things worked in another direction, and also the entire war and the interwar period would have looked completely different if, for example, Russia and the Western powers could have controlled the peace together, instead of Britain and France being alone with that.
Yeah.
And with Germany basically trying to reverse the results of the First World War. They were all non-starters.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe a great way to end, with a kind of tantalizing alternative history of the 20th century.
Well, we cannot redo history.
Yeah,
yes.
We can rerun the experiment. The book is On a Knife Edge: How Germany Lost the First World War. It's out in paperback with Cambridge University Press. I read it in English. The original is in German. Fantastic book. There's a lot in here that obviously we were not able to cover in this conversation, but a very rich and thought-provoking book. Holger, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, David, for having me.